d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4. Okay, this is a startup of the all King's Indian variations. When white is taking the center, we try to defend with d6 to stop the pawns going, but they still keep in mind this idea. So let's see now the setups when white is putting his knight to e2, not to f3. There are two ways of doing this. First playing bishop d3 and then knight g2, or immediately knight g2. Let's start with bishop d3 system, short castle, and now knight g2. It's a very solid system, of course, because white already developed his pieces, and most important, he keeps his f pawn free for f3 or f4, and it's quite flexible. I mean, usually it's also kind of Zemish, because after f3, bishop e3, they can settle up these pieces. But also they keep in mind to, after e5, d5, to put the knight to g3. So, I mean, it's a flexible plan. There are different ways of attacking this center, white center, with knight c6, e5, e5 immediately, c5 immediately. I will recommend you here to play a6. And depending of what white will do, we will have our reaction. For example, there are two moves here, main moves for white. If he wants to stop our potential before threats after, for example, c5, we wanted to play b5 with a4. Then we switch the plans. We go e5. And after d5, we have a typical, very strong move a5, securing the black squares, the control over the black squares c5 and b4 for our pieces. That would be knight would go to one knight to b4, another knight to c5, and we would really have an excellent control over the queen sides. Actually, one of the main points in the King's Indian is who will control this queen side. Usually it's white, but if black manages to stop this and to block these pawns on the queen side, then it's very favorable to black. In this case, it's of course it's good for black. So that's why after a6, the main line is short castle. Then we are coming with the our prepared move, tricky move. We are not in rush to play c5. We still are watching what he's doing. Knight bd7. Now, next move, in almost of the cases we will play c5, because if he pushes the pawn, the knight will jump to e5. So let's see, if f4, then after c5, d5, we have an excellent version of Benko. cb, queen b6, especially using this, the weakness, the tactical weakness, the king on g1. So, I mean, he has to spend more time. He cannot protect this bishop e3 because of knight g4. So that's already a good version. For example, if he goes here after queen b6, if he goes away to h1, then after a b5, bishop b5, we can have this typical sacrifice on e4. Not sacrifice, sorry, it's just, we can take simply this pawn. On queen b6, we said bishop e3, it's knight g4. So in f4 move altogether, it doesn't make really much sense here, because it's weakening the king, and it doesn't really control the center after c5. More tricky move and more subtle move, it's bishop c2 here. 8, move bishop c2. We still continue with c5. We want to destroy the center. d5, knight e5, b3, and again this sacrifice on b5. So what happens if he takes this pawn? This is a good question. We take back first, of course. And another type of compensation after bishop a6, knight bc3, and queen a5. The difference with the typical Benko positions is that the white square bishops are on the board. But as we see from, if to compare them, of course, our bishop is much more active than his bishop. And otherwise, we have very typical setup for black. So that should be good for black. Let's say bishop d2, we just finished development, rook fb8, knight a4, queen c7. And rook c1, the rook has to go one day from this diagonal, bishop b5, knight ac3, bishop a6. Of course, we want to jump at some moment to d3. I mean, it's very difficult to advise white how to improve their position here. So, on bishop c2, we said c5, knight e5 and b5. This is easy. On knight g3 here, again, we are using the fact, after knight g3, that this bishop on d3 is misplaced. Comparing with the lines, we will check later when bishop is going immediately to e2. Here we use this fact because after c5, d5, first we attack the knight with h5, a4, h4, knight e2, h3, g3, and only now knight e5. So what is this is the moment we have to discuss a little bit more deep. The point is that the bishop cannot run, the pawn on c4 is hanging. So for sure we secure that we can always in any moment take on d3. This is the first moment. And the second moment is that we are choosing the right moment for doing it. For example, after e3 we still take our time with knight fd7. After b3 already we take because he wanted to go away. Jump with another knight to e5. Queen c2 and bishop d7. Now one also important middle game idea for this knight on e5. Knight e5 against the pawns. What is going on here? Usually white tries to push it away, the knight from e5, by playing f4. And it works out very well when the white has the pawn on h3. But in this case, after f4, we can always have this brilliant square on g4. So this is not only about king c. This is generally about this knight e5 against the f pawn. So if we control the square g4 after f4, so he cannot push back with h3, then this I call this eternal knight. I mean, it cannot really be moved. And this is very important consideration when you put the knight to e5. So that's more or less clear. After knight d7, he can also try here bishop g5. But that doesn't make much of the difference. We can do the same c5, d5, knight e5. Let's see f4 with bishop on g5. I think it's even worse for white, because after queen d3, our hand should immediately go b5 without thinking, because here this compensation is really very strong. I mean, he even doesn't dare to take this pawn because the bishop from this diagonal will take everything. I don't know how many targets are there. That's about bishop g5, knight d7. He can also do h3. It's another way of prophylaxis. Same, we're doing same. c5, if d5, then knight e5. He might try here bishop e3, then we have another excellent move here, b6. Actually, this is about, we are trying to get either the positions of Benko after d5, b5, or knight e5 and b5, or hedgehog type of positions, like in this example. After a4, we take cd4, knight d4. This was my game with Ivan Sokolov in Poikovsky in 2006. And bishop b7. He tried here the plan with a5 immediately. But if, for example, he is going b4, also very ambitious move, then after rook c8, knight f3, we can always jump knight g4 and take on c3. On a5, I played knight c5, ab, queen b6, and on queen b1, I should simply take this bishop, knight d3, queen d3, and play queen c7, attacking this b and c pawn. Okay, normal, typical position. I mean, with two bishops, and it should be more or less balanced position. So that's this type of position, kind of hedgehog. So what is the conclusion about this intermediate conclusion about the whole lines with bishop d3, knight g2? The plans are with a6, knight d7, preparing c5, and followed on most of the cases with knight e5, and if necessary b5. White also can try to play here on the fifth move immediately knight ge2, sorry. And that's a good question, because myself I used to play this, and this line is not that simple as it looks like, because white, he wants to keep the knight on g3 and then to go for a very clear plan with knight g3, bishop e2, short castle, and wait for black's reaction. Here I would not waste your time too much here, but I will point out your attention to one important thing. So after knight g2 we have to go short castle, knight g3, that's their main. After f3 we transpose to the Zemish, so we don't discuss it in this chapter. e5, it's a very natural move, d5, and the point comes here. One of the ideas for white is to play with h4, after h5 to play bishop g5, and then even sometime bishop e2 and bishop takes h5. That's the most typical attack for white. So let's have for our queen, just in case, an escape to those squares b6 or a5. So we start with c6 here. That's what you have to remember. Let's say here he starts immediately after c6, he goes h4. Then we take on d5 and play h5. Now his plan with bishop g5 and bishop e2, bishop h5, it's losing in its power, because after bishop g5 we have a very comfortable move, queen b6. Queen d2, we are going very fast, knight bd7. Bishop e2, knight c5. So we placed this all sacrifices on h5 or doesn't work here, because first of all we have pressure here, second we went away from the pin. So now he has to defend the pawn on e4, I don't know, but after bishop d7, knight f1, knight h7, we can see that something wrong with white's position, because they are confused with all the pieces, knight f1, bishop e3, they cannot find the right places, and even this pawn on h4, if they want to make short castle, it's already advanced and it can become a weakness. It's weakening the king. So we checked the plan when they really continue their traditional h4. Here it doesn't work after c6. And if it doesn't work, then he has to go for the normal move bishop e2. And then we are going to one of the most typical plans when we put in the King's Indian the structure e5, d5, then we bring the knight to c5 after a5, short castle, knight a6. Let's say if bishop g5, h6, it doesn't help him. And actually, important point always to know is this h pawn attacking the g3 with knight with h5, h4. This is very unpleasant always for white. So let's see if after knight a6 he's doing the normal move, bishop e3, without wasting time for bishop g5, because anyway h5 is useful for black. So bishop e3, we play h5, bishop g5, try to pin. This is one of the very typical ideas. Bishop d7, queen d2, knight c5, b3, so cd5. Yes, now if he takes cd5, we just will bring, as we said here, queen to b6 and have normal situation. And if he is taking here this ed5, then also we get a typical situation after queen c7. It looks like neither structure already, but it's a good version for black. It's all pieces out, and I would say that it's a balanced position. So let's again make one more conclusion about the both plans with knight g2 immediately on the fifth move, and the bishop d3 and then knight g2. So if they play on the fifth move bishop d3 followed by knight g2, then we go first short castle, then put the knight to d7, keeping in mind these two possible moves c5 and a5. If he's playing after a6, a4, then we switch to e5 and then take the squares after d5. The square c5 and before by playing a5 under control. If he allows us to play c5, then after d5 we always keep in mind this attack of the bishop on d3 and pawn on c4 with knight e5, and always keep in mind this b5 pawn sacrifice. In the setup with fifth move knight g2, we go for short castle again, then e5, and very important move, this move c6, in order simply to avoid this attack with h4, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop h5. Otherwise, our plan would be c6, a5, knight a6, knight c5, typical King's Indian plan, and cd5. On the other side, we can always improve our position by playing h5 and having pressure on this knight on g3.